Okay, foundational things. Get sunlight in your eyes in the morning, especially on cloudy days. Deliberate cold exposure is one way to enrich the amount of brown fat. You get a stronger furnace. The effects are significant, they are long lasting, and they appear to exist after just one session of this quiet 17-minute interoception. Try and get your sleep right. Now, younger people with different schedules, like, don't give up a social life. You need about 8 ounces or 240 milliliters of fluid per hour for the first 10 hours of your day after waking.
Dr. Andrew Huberman is quite well known for his thoughtful and systematic takes on all things health and fitness. When it comes to someone who assesses the data, comes to a thoughtful and well-reasoned conclusion about it, there may not be too many people out there who do that better than him. And this is precisely why he is becoming well-respected, even when he has takes that go against the grain, unless it comes to matters of faith. Except I don't see any difference in the way he assesses the data in a situation like that, especially when it comes to the most deep and thoughtful questions we have about the universe. I say this because I and many other people are the exact same way. When it comes to these big questions of life, we like to sift through the data and come to reasonable conclusions. And I see no reason or evidence as to why Dr. Andrew Huberman does anything different when it comes to matters of the divine. And yet, when he speaks on those things, for some reason, those clips just don't gain the same traction as when he's giving health or fitness advice. Of all the viral clips of this man, why did this one go under the radar? Before we find out, make sure you hit that subscribe button because it definitely helps videos like this reach a wider audience.
Brain and all the, I mean, you mentioned it last night, and this had me thinking. It's like, when you think how all that works, I have to take an aside and say, how could that happen in nature is without a creator?
Yeah, so, well, here's the thing. I mean, we know that the programs, meaning genes, so genes, DNA, and there's DNA, then there's RNA, and then there's proteins. And proteins are the action end of the game where they say, hey, like, grow over here, don't grow over there, you know, become this kind of cell, dopamine cell or a serotonin cell. We know that those mechanisms are incredibly well conserved from mice to humans. Now, certain things happen in the human brain that you don't see in other species, like the elaboration of the parts of the brain that are involved in context and planning, especially. But the memory systems, the ones that control hormones, breathing, heart rate, they're very similar. Not exactly the same, but very similar.
Okay.
When you start to study and understand brain development, as I did, or neuroplasticity, or dopamine, you have to, meaning, I don't care if you're an atheist, agnostic, or believer in creator, you have to step back and just go, wow, wow. Now, then of course there's this difference among scientists as to who believes in God, who doesn't. I'll just go on record. I'm very comfortable saying I believe in God. I do. I think there are many things that science can explain. There are certain things science can't explain, but I'll even go a step further, which is that all the elements of science are entirely compatible with the idea of there being a God. And I'm not the first scientist to say this. I mean, Einstein believed in God. Carl Jung, one of the greatest psychologists ever, clearly believed in God. There are many atheist scientists. There are agnostic scientists who are just kind of like unsure, right? And, you know, for me, I'm in absolute awe of biology. It's just incredible that we're sitting here having this conversation. It's just, it's with language, that there are little sound waves that you're perceiving and understanding. I mean, it's just, and I think the brain represents the apex of incredible in terms of biology. Like the heart is interesting, the immune system is interesting, the liver is interesting, but the brain is unbelievable.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the number of different ways you can move your body compared to another species. Think about what you did today. Think about what I was attempting to do today, right?
Yeah.
Spectacular. Think about technology. These lights, the, you know, Tesla cars, spaceships. I mean, the internet. I mean, unbelievable. And yet, oh, so real.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, we could talk a bit about how I, you know, Well, I'll just say this. Secretly, I've always prayed. I grew up in a split religion home. My family's like the UN. We've got people from Guatemala, Denmark, Argentina, New York. Like all the different political battles are in my family. Super left, super right, libertarians, lefties to the, it's crazy. Thanksgivings can be difficult.
Yeah.
But I'll say this, I absolutely pray. I absolutely love that the idea, but also what for me is really a deep belief, which is that we can't control everything. We're not in as much control as we think we are. And that the magnificence of biology and the magnificence of nature is, it's impossible for me to conceive how that could come about any other way. It just is. Now, yeah, I mean, I think that, full stop.
Who do you pray to?
That's an interesting one because I think God. Yeah. So I absolutely do. I've actually started reading the Bible recently, start to finish. I feel like it's my duty to like learn and in some sense compare Old and New Testament. I'm really interested in the stories, but I'm fascinated by the story of us, right? And the story of everything. And so, but yeah, I pray out loud in the morning, sometimes again in the middle of the night if I wake up. And it's only recently that I've been doing this more often.
It's giving you peace? Or?
Oh, my goodness. It's given me so much. It's given me peace. And, this is going to sound weird and probably people are going to be like, what are you talking about? It works. It works. There's a way in which certain things I was grappling with, I just couldn't resolve. I couldn't do it. And it was all internal and I just couldn't do it.
How were you trying to resolve these things? Like have an answer?
Yeah, discipline myself. I mean, it wasn't like I was super, undisciplined. I mean, obviously I have a lot of self-discipline, but I always pray, I want to remove my defects of character. I always wanted to have a deeper relationship to God. I always wanted that. And I kind of was like, why don't I have that? Well, duh. That's like saying I want to be fit. Why I'm not fit? Well, because you're not running, you're not lifting, you're not doing the things. It was like, and it was a couple of different people that kept showing up in my life and they were doing it. And it was like, well, pray. And, I've learned, and I certainly try and do this, that a lot of prayer is about listening. And a lot of prayer is about you ask for things or listen for things. And then an hour later, 2 days later, you go, wait, like it doesn't happen in the moment necessarily, just like fitness. I don't want to compare fitness. I don't want to trivialize prayer by comparing to fitness, but there's some parallels that are relevant. Yeah.
It's consistent work.
Yeah, it's consistent work. And then all of a sudden, like things come up and you're like, oh my goodness, I can't believe it. That makes so much sense.
Now, there were many things in that little clip that we just watched that might be topics of their own, well worth their own video one time. If there was anything in particular that you saw in there that you would like to hear about in a full video, let me know down below in the comments. But there were two things that Dr. Huberman said that I want to give just a little bit more context and flesh out. One thing he said is that science can't explain everything. Now, many materialist scientists like Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris would disagree. But let's just take that statement from Dr. Huberman, flip it around a little bit so that you see why a Dawkins or a Harris would actually be mistaken. Dr. Huberman says that science can't explain everything. What if we say the opposite is true? Science can explain everything. Do you see something flawed about that statement? The big problem with that statement is that it's not a scientific statement. There's no scientific metric by which we can assess that statement that science can explain everything. It's not possible with science. I love science. I'm a huge fan of the scientific process, but it seems obviously true that we depend on truth statements that are outside of science to function well in the universe. I think it would do well for some of those materialist scientists to actually study some basic philosophy so as to understand when they commit logical fallacies. In this case, such as believing the statement, science can explain everything. The other thing that Dr. Huberman mentioned that I want to point out is the idea that prayer works. What's crazy is that it does, and there's actual science to back this up. On this channel, we focus a lot on the intellectual hurdles that might be holding someone back from believing in God. But as we just said, science doesn't hold the truth to everything. So if it's not the intellectual hurdles that you struggle with when it comes to believing whether or not God exists, but it's more on the emotional side, the only thing that I could encourage you to do would be to earnestly pray something along the lines of, God, I don't actually believe you exist, but I want to know the truth. If you do, please reveal yourself to me. I completely understand that something like that probably seems silly and completely ridiculous, but if you were to do that, if you were to honestly say that, God, I don't think you exist, but I earnestly want to know whether or not you do, you would be one of countless people, especially professionals coming from the STEM field, that have prayed that same prayer and have come to know some deeper truth. As Dr. Huberman said, if you really want to know about a certain habit or a practice, whether or not it holds any value or truth to it, you're not going to know unless you actually practice that habit. And I would honestly put it this way, you owe it to nobody but yourself, and you do owe it to yourself. As C.S. Lewis once remarked, this is the most important question that we are ever going to ask of ourselves, whether or not God exists. Have you really given that question the full weight that it deserves in your life? I'm not going to criticize you if you come to a different conclusion than the one I have, but truly, it is the most important question you will ever ask. You deserve to know the answer, whether or not you end up believing that God exists or you don't. You deserve to weigh all the evidence and come to a conclusion. And yes, as we've alluded to before, some of the evidence for the existence of God lies outside the scientific realm. Now, a lot of it lies within the scientific realm. But if you want a place where you can find some of both, some of the evidence for God within science and some of the evidence outside of science, make sure you stay tuned to this channel.